because Joe Biden doesn't have a checking account that says international slush fund.
Oh my
Please
God.
deposit here. No, I'm not done. I'm not even close to done. By the Chinese government.
Yeah, so that's Hunter Biden, not Joe Biden.
I hate that. Every time you say that, I want to take a fucking hammer and I want to smash. So if fiscal conservatives are going to bitch and moan that we're $40 trillion in debt, then they need to fucking ante up and say we need to pay some of this shit down, which means that rich people are going to have to pay taxes.
Fuck yeah, that's based.
In reference to Hasan getting deported, one of the words
Deported,
that I
not
kept
deported,
hearing
not
repeatedly-
deported. He wasn't deported.
God, I wish.
Anyone who professes communism is just simply not allowed to get benefits from the government. They're not allowed to do that. And
Holy
likewise,
shit, I wish.
You wish?
So I wish. I'm not saying it's good. You won. Pisco, I'm just gonna say it. You won.
Hey folks, please like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to check out my newsletter. Information is in the description.
So back to my stance with the conservatives. As far as I know, I get DMs. I have a chat, and the chat, 80 to 100 people, depending on the day, right? And so half of them are libs who are pissed at libs. Then the other ones are like conservatives, conservatarians, who don't like Trump. Then I have like 2 or 3 groypers or 2 or 3 Christian nationalists who do like Trump, but they like fighting. They like fighting with me for their entertainment. And so that's really I actually have a pretty broad spectrum of political sensibility in my chat. However, what I would say is with the conservatarians, they oftentimes are people who don't like Trump for whatever reason. Whereas I would say 90% of Republicans have just made peace that Trump is kind of where the Republican Party is. And so I just get DMs from people who are like, thank you for speaking up. There's nobody else. Everybody else has either become a Democrat or they've joined the Trump train. And so, yeah, it's pretty isolating. There's only a few of us.
Do you feel like a little bit alone sometimes when you're like, who would you count among your peers? Is it really just the people from here? I'm thinking of the Bulwark. Is it really just those people?
Yeah, but even the Bulwark have abandoned my position because a lot of them have just started saying Democrats are good. They just started shilling Democrat talking.
So speaking of gay people, what about this guy Brad Palumbo? He seems pretty.
Oh, I DM Brad. I actually like Brad a lot.
I just DM'd him too.
Yeah, Brad. I retweeted something. He retweeted me. I DM'd him or whatever. I watched a couple of his videos. And effectively, I think that he feels pretty isolated as well, where nobody quite represents his interests. And so he's fighting everybody all the time. And so, yeah, I think of Brad as someone, we might not see eye to eye on policy. I'm not aware of all those policies, but I see him as someone who's similarly politically isolated.
Sometimes I kind of have it with you, Connor. I don't believe it. I don't believe this this performative outrage is some of the things that Democrats do. So, for example, I hear
shit. You think I wasn't pissed off last night? I was
what are you
actually
even mad about?
Yeah,
you don't even know.
Funny,
you don't even know what you're mad about. Like, you couldn't even say what you're mad about. You just remember being mad and being righteous.
Yes, I could.
Yeah, what were you mad about?
I literally spent 5 minutes articulating how Democrats are dry and over-explain policy. And then Econo Boy was like, this is the perfect time for me to be dry and over-explain policy and beat Hutch with a rhetorical bat in front of Connor for 30 minutes. That's what happened.
Yeah, but the thing is, he was having...
But it's your show, so you're allowed to be dry and boring?
Well, the show is generally... I mean, we're boring people. We're boring people.
Sure.
And the people who enjoy my show, they're probably boring people too. Not my stream, but that show specifically, I try to be as boring as possible, so we do boring things on a boring show. Why are you shaking your head? You don't think I'm ever exciting or interesting?
You gotta be, man. You got listen. Where's the energy?
Where's the energy?
Where's the hatred?
Where's the energy?
Where is your sense of rage? What the fuck?
What the fuck? What are you talking about? Have you heard me? Don't I sound enraged? Don't I sound mad all the time? And you
just said that you're trying to be boring as hell on that.
It's called a joke.
Podcast.
It's called a joke. I'm not serious. It's a bit. I was doing a bit. It's not actually a boring show. Everyone should watch it.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So I genuinely think that he was trying to say, we agree with you and be like, we should be more exciting and we should be more simple.
And simple.
And he's like, one way to do that is this. And then you guys attacked him for being like, no, that's too crazy. That's too crazy. Let's get into the substance about why that's crazy or why that will never happen. So it seems like Econo Boy, you were passing the ball to Econo Boy, who was like, here's an idea of how it can be more simple. And you guys are like, no. It's that idea of how to make things more simple is too complicated. I just don't know what you're asking for. You would have been mad no matter what.
No, that's not what was being said. What was being said is that Econo Boy took what I said of being too simple of like, well, we can just have universal, broad social programs that are popular in Europe. And what Hutch and I said is you guys can't even make it out of the fucking primaries. So how about you worry about getting out of the primary first, and then we can talk about your broad universal thing. And then what Econo Boy said is, well, you're putting the cart before the horse because policy is downstream from whatever. So if Democratic politicians just start trying to popularize
you can disagree. You can
disagree. Further left-wing policy,
you can disagree.
Then we'll win.
You can disagree with that. But he wasn't.
I do disagree with that.
Okay, you do disagree with that. He wasn't trying to have, he wasn't inviting a conversation on the merits of the policy. He was trying to have a conversation that you were saying is, let's do simple things. And I think that you guys misconstrued him as trying to have a wonky type discussion when I don't think that was his aim. And every time you guys tried to catch him on some aspect of how it will be implemented or how it will get passed or the logistics of it, Econo Boy had to stress numerous times, hey, I'm not actually having the discussion here. I'm just saying what we should run on. I don't know. You can't say.
Yeah, and then it took 40 minutes for him to explain it. So no, that's probably not great.
And there was at one point where you weren't even listening. I find that sometimes where you're just waiting for sometimes you do listen. And I give you credit for that. Sometimes you really don't listen. And in fact, where's Mrs. Points? Let's get her take on this. I'm just kidding. But
she'll already tell you that I don't listen.
Really?
I'm a very selective listener.
In what respect, Charlie?
It has to be interesting to me.
Well, all I'm saying is there was one point in which Econo was making a point. He hadn't even finished his sentence, and you were already saying that he was being ridiculous, even though he was responding to a completely different point. I think sometimes you get triggered by something you say 10 minutes ago, and then it's like someone having these shower arguments, and your brain is running through all the gauntlet of the different things that you wanted to say, and then you reach to a point, not unlike, by the way, your methodical approach of answering comments whereby you missed my comments that were spamming you. You want to be comprehensive as possible, and that means going back in time in the conversation and bringing it back to time equals zero. What do you think of
that? Yeah, I have Bo Dickerson, phasers are AIDS from 11:36 a.m. highlighted. It's currently 12:33 p.m. But here's where I'm going to disagree with you, though. My points are typically relevant to what's going on because, as an example, I almost guarantee you this is exactly what you're thinking about. Hutch and I both made the point. If we wanted to talk about rhetoric, we could have just talked about rhetoric, but we should have kept it as vague as possible, where we weren't talking about specific policy prescriptions. But what ended up happening was Econo Boy went into specific policy prescriptions, and so Hutch and I were arguing, here's why people don't like these specific policy prescriptions. So you can say that Econo Boy was making some reference to rhetoric, but I was saying that your underlying argumentation is also dog shit. So that's still a relevant point.
Okay. Well, listen,
this happened 12 hours ago. You can't appeal to this is 5 years ago, so you forgot what happened. This happened 12 hours ago. I remember almost the entire conversation.
Sometimes I think you have a penchant for forgetting certain things. Where are we on Burisma stuff? Are you still... would you be willing to go on Tim Pool to argue Burisma with me?
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Dude, just because this is one of the things that actually pisses me off about liberals and Democrats and progressives. Just because someone is worse doesn't mean that something bad didn't happen over here. And so you're saying, well, this is infinitely worse. And I agree, by the way, that the Trump admin is guilty of 1,000x the corruption, the accused corruption of the Biden family. They are guilty of it 1,000-fold. However, that doesn't mean that we didn't have nepotism and cronyism on this side.
Yeah, but do you see me as a hack? Crime. Do you see me fundamentally as a hack? Because
convictable crimes.
Okay, but I have consistently come out and stood on business and said that Biden's pardons were corrupt. I said that I think Merrick Garland did a good job, or did at least he's not doing a flagrantly bad job, as everyone seems to be accusing him of. I've said that the Hur report, in real time, I was criticizing Dems who were saying that the Hur report was somehow wrong, or it shouldn't have been done, or that Robert Hur was being political. I, in real time, was calling that out. And so I feel like I've built up enough credibility with some of these takes to be like, I'm not that kind of person. And yet I think that you try to paint me as this kind of like DNC shill, as this kind of DNC incarnate. Like if I want to get a DNC
shill,
take,
yeah.
A Biden shill.
Yeah.
What's your actually? What is your standard for a Biden shill?
Well, what I would say is,
wait, can I ask you a question? As between like me and Steven, who's more of a Biden shill?
Oh, Steven, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So bear in mind, like when you have like a dozen conversations, sometimes they can get mixed up in your head. However, very specifically, I'll tell you where you were charitable, and I'll tell you where you weren't, and I have a specific memory about it. But I'm also going to tell you the overarching environment in which we were.
Sure.
Okay. So the overarching environment in which we were, Rob Noor and I actually had a certain degree of overlap where we believed that the Burisma story and the tax evasion and the IRS whistleblowers was a thing. And it was a problem. And it was corruption and it was nepotism. And what was happening from your side, the liberals, the Democrats or whatever, is we were called liars, conspiracy theorists, bad faith, all that bullshit. And on top of that, one of the biggest dramas that I was ever in was on Steven's channel with half a dozen fucking orbiters all taking turns trying to kick my dick in over Hunter Biden calling me a conspiracy theorist. So that's the environment that we were in. And then you and I had I don't know why you're making a face. Why are you making a face?
Because we're talking, I think what happened there was like Twitter files nonsense, where you're like, you're still in this Twitter files
but Twitter
world.
files moved into Biden, and the hotter fight was over Biden.
The hotter fight being what? Has anyone said Hunter Biden is completely innocent of everything? Whose position has that been?
They said it's not a big deal. They said it's funny. They said it's funny that he was peddling international influence to corrupt entities and doing drugs and banging whores.
Find one person. Find one person. I literally want to challenge you to find one person who said, who said that it was funny when Hunter Biden is peddling his family name to international clients.
Just go watch the VOD, man. Just go watch the fucking VOD.
No one ever said that, dude.
Steven didn't think it was a big deal. All his fucking orbiters didn't think it was a big deal. And they accused me of being a fucking conspiracy theorist for giving a shit about it at all.
No, the conspiracy, the alleged conspiracy, it is an alleged conspiracy. You are alleging a conspiracy. But I know what you mean when you say conspiracy theorist. What you're alleging.
Can I tell you specifically what I allege?
Yeah, let's do.
Okay. So I allege, and this might be a problem with DC in general, that what happened was Hunter Biden got a JD. Okay, so he got a legal degree. Right?
I'm aware what a JD is.
Then, when his dad was in influence within multiple administrations, he went internationally and proposed that he would be a consultant for various firms. And as a legal consultant for various firms, including a Ukrainian firm and a Chinese firm, that both had pretty shady shit going on with it, he took tens of thousands of dollars per month in fees and accepted gifts, effectively promising these people that he would get them some kind of insider influence into the Washington, D.C. circle to make their lives easier for international commerce. And then what happened is he implied that he would use his ties to Joe specifically to do it. Now, he never followed through on it, which is how they've avoided like actual corruption charges, is he never followed through on the peddling influence part of it, but actually looking at deliverable services, things that are measurable that he delivered to both Burisma and to the Chinese company. It's very hard to articulate what he actually delivered to these companies.
It is very hard because we have at most he hired a law firm, he hired a lobbyist group, Blue Star Strategies, or he had some ties that he actually did work at a law firm before. So it's not just that he got a JD and ran off to consulting. He has had experience doing legal work before, but none of this is, he has a name. Anytime Hunter Biden are we saying that he should have to be a painter? hidden in the mountains, and if he interacts with anyone who you don't like or who's an international client, that we should read into that some level of criminality or corruption. That's what I never understood and was never proven.
He should when he's lobbying for forced organizations, he should comply with whatever FAR regulations regulate his behavior, and he should pay his fucking taxes.
Well, yeah,
those are the main.
But I disagree with pardoning Hunter Biden, and I think that it was corrupt to pardon Hunter Biden, and I think he did. Violate the law when it came to taxes.
Here's the other thing.
But I never made apologies
like
for it. I never made apologies for it, and I never said that was okay.
Here's the other side. Here's the other part where I feel like your side is being obtuse. They say because Joe Biden doesn't have a checking account that says international slush fund.
Oh my
please
God.
Deposit here. No, I'm not done. I'm not even close to done. Because he doesn't have a checking account that says international slush fund, please deposit here.
No one says this.
That Hunter Biden, plenty of people say this, that Hunter Biden, there's nothing you can get
on
Joe.
No one says he needs to have a bank account that says slush fund on it.
You said this on Twitter.
No, I never did.
You said this on Twitter.
No, I never did.
You got nothing on Joe, right? You got nothing on Joe,
Yeah, you got
right?
nothing on Joe. It doesn't mean that I said that the standard is there needs to be a slush fund, labeled slush fund account. That is a bit of hyperbole. That's hyperbole on your part.
You are asking for.
No, it's not.
That's the level of evidence that you are asking for.
How?
Because Hunter has taken tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars and gifted it to various members of the Biden family, and then also started a financial firm with his uncle, Joseph's brother, and then funneled his legalistic earnings into that as well.
Can we be clear what we're talking about? So
we're talking about building tens of millions of dollars of wealth off of the back of international lobbying.
When Hunter Biden gives money for like his children's college, would you say that's funneling money to his children? Is that what you mean by funneling money?
No, I'm talking about gifts to nephews and nieces. And I'm also talking about gifts to a charitable organization
money
that
is
his sister was in charge of.
Money is fungible. So yeah, I agree that he accepted some money and made some purchases. That doesn't mean that when you say funneling money, what you're implying is some kind of nefarious or criminal activity in funneling, but you need to actually show that. And so you let the generic term do the work for you.
Can I tell you what was criminal about it?
Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, it was giving gifts and not declaring it anywhere about whether or not it was taxable income.
I agree. He evaded taxes. He did pay his taxes, but we don't have a disagreement on that. But the problem is people tried to make it something different. People tried to say, oh, this is proof that they fired the prosecutor, this and that. This is proof that, that they were trying to manipulate the Chinese or trying to give access to the Chinese and were giving them gifts to the Chinese in exchange. Right? So there's this whole nefarious scheme.
Biden was receiving gifts from a Chinese energy industry magnate who was later corrupted or basically later disappeared by the Chinese government.
Yeah, so that's Hunter Biden, not Joe Biden.
I hate that. Every time you say that, I want to take a fucking hammer and I want to smash my testicles against the desk.
Why?
Whenever you say that.
Why?
Why?
Yeah, why?
Why? Yeah, what? Because anybody with a fucking IQ above 80 could say a family member benefiting from another family's prestige and then funneling that money back into the family is at minimum
funneling. There's that word. No, it is unethical for Hunter Biden to be gallivanting and basically trading on his influence, which I take him to be. Yeah. I think that's distasteful. But I'm just going to tell you, it's commonplace among politicians that people use their name.
It should be barred.
It should be barred to have a influential name. Like what? How do we just disconnect the fact that Hunter Biden is related to a prominent person? Like he's not allowed to use his name. I don't even understand what that means to bar someone from getting access because of who they are.
Yeah, I would actually say I would have to look at FARA in order to see
FARA is
what
different.
Is appropriate versus inappropriate. Hold on. I would have to look at FARA in lobbying rules in order to see what is inappropriate versus inappropriate and what's legal versus illegal and what's like unethical versus ethical. But hold on, Pisco, I'm going to make this point to you, okay? As an insurance person who was like made less than $100K a year, I was prohibited from receiving gifts from any vendor within the industry under ethics rules, under threat of being fired. Okay. So if that's the ethical standards for wages who are making less than 100K a year, why don't we have that ethical standard for people who are making millions of dollars per year?
Yeah, I don't know what that ethical standard would look like and in what context it would be. Like boards of directors. So think about this rule. New ethical rule.
Like in lobbying, you're not allowed to accept gifts.
Rules.
All income has to be declared.
Well, the whole question is whether Hunter himself was lobbying or whether it was Burisma via Blue Star Strategies and who the actual lobbyist was. So there's, if you're a director of an organization and you hire a lobbyist, do you need to register as FARA? Or does the organization's actual lobbyist need to register as FARA? You understand that difficulty there? If Hunter Biden is pointing or is helping the board decide to appoint Blue Star Strategies, which is the entity that needs to register under FARA? Is it every member of the board of directors, or is it the actual lobbyist on behalf of Burisma? That's the question.
I think it's the actual lobbyist under Burisma.
And so Blue Star Strategies did actually afterwards, I think, backfile registration that they were lobbying on behalf of a foreign principal, namely Burisma, because just so you guys are aware, FARA includes both foreign countries, but it also includes like foreign incorporated businesses. And so Burisma itself, it wouldn't need to just be Ukraine. Burisma itself would be something under FARA. But I just want to go ahead.
Sorry, what are you done?
No, I wasn't done. I wasn't done. So the kind of ethics rule that it sounds like you want to propose is to be on a board of director, they're not allowed to consider your prominence or your family name, or they can't be nepotistic in terms of international businesses appointing people on boards of directors. That they can't use nepotism, and I don't even understand what that would look like and how it would be enforceable.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So let me go ahead and describe further what I would do. Okay, so what I would do, let's say that I'm a congressman overnight, or let's say that let's just say I'm a congressman, so I can propose legislation. I think that AOC and Massey and somebody else, it actually might have been one of the Pauls, I forget. But effectively, they want to ban insider trading. And what I would go almost a step further, and I would say that any member of Congress, we should double or triple salaries.
What the fuck does this have to do with Hunter Biden? You're just yapping.
I'm not done. We should double or triple congressional salaries, and then all wealth should effectively be put into a blind trust. That's what I would do, 100%.
What does that have to do with Hunter Biden? Hunter Biden's not a member of Congress.
Because effectively what you're doing is number one, you're being obtuse. Number two, okay. What you're saying is that because legalistically, by having Hunter Biden as a consultant on a board, and because he appointed technically somebody else to do the lobbying, he doesn't need to register under FARA. So what he did is technically okay. And what I'm saying is, anybody who's on the outside of Washington, D.C., who doesn't rub elbows within Washington, D.C., effectively think that it's a problem that we have foreign private businesses and foreign governments who are funneling hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, into the United States Congress, and they are influencing, they are unduly influencing our politics.
Is AIPAC a problem?
Yeah, so is Qatar.
Why wouldn't you just say AIPAC is a problem then?
I just said AIPAC is a problem. I said AIPAC is a problem, and then I said Qatar is also a problem.
People will stress and say, well, AIPAC, the technicalities matter, and so even though it's wink, wink, nudge, nudge with the Netanyahu government,
no, I don't give
even
a
though
shit.
It's wink, wink, nudge,
no.
nudge.
I was literally just watching Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson debate that, and I think that Ted Cruz is being obtuse. Well, the same way you're being obtuse, by the way. Ted Cruz is saying, oh, it's a domestic lobbying organization.
It is.
And then Tucker Carlson says, for what? And then Ted Cruz goes, but Tucker's in order to have a better friendship between Israel and the United States.
Tucker is equivocating, right? Tucker is equivocating. On the one hand, he's using the term on behalf of whom. That can mean on behalf of whom, meaning an agency relationship, or on behalf of whom, mean like what is the cause? And Tucker is purposely playing around with the meaning. Because he's a sly guy. I think we agree. Tucker, he's not a stupid guy.
He's very sly.
He's a sly guy. And so he's playing around with the looseness of the language there. And yeah, AIPAC is arguing, I would argue, on behalf of Israel in the sense of they're arguing in favor of Israel, but not in the sense of an agency relationship, or at least that's not been proven. Otherwise, their conduct would need to be registered conduct. So that's the kind of fast and looseness there. But those technicalities, I think, matter. And anything that goes beyond those technicalities, now it starts to look a little scary. So now we're saying, okay, if you're a family member of a prominent politician, there's some kind of substantive limitation on what board, like of private boards of directors you can go on. Like, what is that? And where does this fit with your idea of small government or, conservative values or an encroaching state? It just feels like, a kind of difficult position.
Because my conservative values, you know what I'm trying to conserve? I'm trying to conserve a republic. I'm trying to conserve like a representative democracy that actually represents its constituents. That's what I'm trying to conserve.
Mm-hmm. Don't you have a right to join a board of directors?
Isn't a man entitled to the sweat of his brow or lack thereof?
So you're a big government conservative.
Sure. Dude, I love the military-industrial complex. I'm a huge fan of slapping lasers onto C-130 gunships. I think it's fucking awesome.
Would you vote for this big, beautiful bill?
No.
Why not?
No, I wouldn't.
Because the debt?
Because I think Republicans use fiscal conservative talking points to appeal to their base and talk about the national debt. Meanwhile, they will never publicly proclaim that tax cuts make the deficit worse and make the debt worse.
I always found that
I think they need to eat their fucking vegetables.
I think that,
Republicans need to eat their fucking vegetables.
I think what you said is super base because when you try to pin them down on this, they're like, taxes don't have any effect on the deficit by definition because they're just lowering taxes, and so you're just getting less, and so it's not affecting the deficit. Like, they have this weird twisted logic, I think, based on the notion that taxation is inherently theft or something, or it's inherently this evil thing to do, and that's kind of informing it. But that's interesting. So your rationale here seems to be grounded in own the righties, own the bad faith righties.
The debt matters or it doesn't, right? So from my perspective, there is a fiscal conservative argument that I was brought up with, which is effectively that we are constantly running in billions, now trillions dollars worth of debt. The interest rate on our debt, which by the way is calculating for inflation, is only like 1%. It's some of the best debt you could ever have in your entire life.
But rising.
Well, right. And so then the question becomes like, at what point is servicing the debt so large that it effectively prohibits you to act as a governmental entity? And so what fiscal conservatives are concerned about is that servicing our debt is going to become an increasing share of the pie of our annual budget. And eventually we're going to hit a crisis that is so big that it's going to implode the federal government because we're not going to be able to service our debt and we're not going to be able to deal with an emergency. And hypothetically, I can see that is true. However, I also think that this is money that we technically owe to ourselves. And it's also money that we're charging an exorbitantly low, exorbitant might not be the right word, an extremely low interest rate on. And therefore, it's a balance, right? When you have a fiat currency, it's not based off of an individual commodity like gold. It's based off of the health of the entire economy. So if you had the option between basing an economy on gold and having zero debt, but also having a very poor economy versus having a fiat economy that's very wealthy, but you have some debt, then clearly a fiat economy is superior, right? So the question is, when do we go too far? And so if fiscal conservatives are going to bitch and moan that we're $40 trillion in debt, then they need to fucking ante up and say, we need to pay some of this shit down, which means that rich people are going to have to pay taxes.
Fuck yeah, that's based. Because you gave that concession, I don't view it as a concession because that's just your opinion, but some conservative watchers might construe it as a concession. I just want to be clear. I think that this is not like some kind of debate situation.
They're swimming in Reaganite propaganda that has been infused in the Republican Party for 40 fucking years. What?
Do you think Reagan was a good president?
It's a mixed bag, man. I actually think that we're effectively swimming in the problems that Reagan kicked off.
I agree with that. But I just want to give my version of concession here, and this is going to completely debunk the notion that now I've become a Hasan simp or I've become a socialist, even though I've endorsed a democratic socialist in the mayoral. I don't support like slashing our military budget massively. Find the fraud, find the waste, find the abuse. I'm sure there's a lot of it. You as a former member of the service would agree. But I actually think the military is kind of based. I think the military, when it funds research and stuff, actually works well. One of the parts about abundance that I liked, I've read it twice now, and I think that there are some criticisms that I have, but some things I really like about it, is them pointing out like DARPA and the different research potentialities and the actual success of some of the military / intelligence related research initiatives that have been undertaken. Yeah, sometimes you have a lot of stinkers. You have a lot of bloat and inefficiency, but it's one of the things I feel like that China does is they price that into the cost of getting these great advancements. They price in the fact that some guy steals $1 billion here. They price in the fact that there's going to be waste here and there, stupid idea there. So I'm actually someone that doesn't think that we need massive decrease in spending in the military budget. I agree. Like, I think that we need to increase taxes on the rich. And I think that there are certain other places that we can cut certain kinds of export subsidies. But in general, that's my concession to the right and to the notion that I'm like a socialist now.
Yeah, for me, this is something that my chat's heard me say dozens of times. There's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is physiological security, social ego, self-actualization. I think it's the government's job to secure or heavily subsidize the first two tiers of human need, and then to promote flourishing at the social and ego tier. Otherwise, what the fuck are we doing? What's the point of any of this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I actually don't even think, as I came out and said it, I think the government has certain things that it does best, and it's actually in line with some version of socialism to say that the government should increase government expenditures in this kind of area of defense and of mutual support and research and that kind of thing. And go ahead.
There's something that you're doing that I don't like, though.
What?
And LB, one of my favorite chatters,
LB?
does this as well, where they fall, in my mind, for a right-wing rhetorical trap that actually makes socialism more likely than less likely, which pisses me off. Socialism, definitionally, being on Twitch and YouTube politics for a long time, is decommodification of basic human needs. So food, water, shelter is effectively free. And then it's also workers owning the means of production. Mm-hmm. So in a market economy, everybody would have like a stock share within any institution that they worked as a part of. That would be like the most free market version of like socialism that I could think of. I don't want socialism. I think it puts too much power in central government to regulate private commerce to the point that there's nothing without the state. It's effectively creating the foothold for an authoritarian communist or authoritarian fascist regime. So I'm not interested in it. So I think socialism in that sense is bad. The way that you're using it, where it's like the Dick Wolf meme or the Richard Wolf meme, where it's socialism is when the government does stuff. Yeah, that makes me want to kill myself.
Okay, so I guess that I am doing a little bit of a Richard Wolf meme. You caught me, all right? Put my surrender hands up. Okay, you don't like the big beautiful bill. Can we talk a little bit about when last we spoke? We went through the Kilmer-Berger-Garcia case. I think you and I agreed that even if there's some criminality there, this is about due process. It's about doing it the right way. And the Trump administration eventually got into compliance with what was required, which is to bring him back. Now, I think the way they did it, I think they were not in compliance for the longest time, and that they showed that they could have brought him back anytime he wanted. I think that you and I are vindicated on that. But we also had this discussion about
like malicious compliance, because now they're charging him with crimes too.
Yeah, and we'll take a look at those. And it's possible he did a bunch of bad stuff, and we'll have to see. But I have a little suspicions on some of the stuff. And there's some things that don't look right, especially some of the prosecutors on that case like left it, or at least one resigned as a result of the indictment. I think that's a bad sign. But we had a conversation about Mahmoud Khalil, and we disagreed violently on that. And I wanted to revisit, because I've had a bunch of these conversations on the First Amendment issue and as it relates to immigration matters, as it relates to border matters. And I've had a lot of conversations about the Hasan drama. Have you heard about this detainment at the border nonsense?
Yeah. Oh no.
Yeah.
Fucking Queeman. I know you probably don't know who Queeman is because you don't swim in the drama circles.
I've heard of him now.
He's getting rock hard right now.
Yeah. So now I want to bring this up because I think this is now bringing to light potentially a First Amendment issue that interacts with the immigration authority of the country, and certainly a lot of these security-based rationales interacts with your views on terrorist groups and terrorism. But now it involves a U.S. citizen, perhaps. But it's not a full-on deprivation in the sense of they're not sending him to Sakat.
Yeah, it's a detention.
It's a detention. So I wanted to, even though my chat's going to roll their eyes, I wanted to talk about this with you. I wanted to talk to you about this issue.
The one of the things. So bear in mind, I watched some of Queeman glazing you for being the one liberal who was principled enough to like stand on business for the First Amendment and all that kind of bullshit, despite how much heat you were taking. And what I would say
can I just tell you, I continue to take a lot of heat. My chat and my comments, usually my videos get like 98% thumbs up. Like very positive response, comments very glowing, very nice. Occasional a couple odd comments in there.
For Hasan is like 60.
They're like, it's 60%, it's 70%, it's much lower. The comments are like, I can't believe how far you've fallen. Clearly you're trying to pander to this audience. Clearly you're trying to do
falling off.
You've fallen off, all this shit. And so that's the groundwork there. But give me your initial take here, and then we can go at it.
You know what? I feel like despite the fact that we fight all the time, I feel like I have a brother in arms now, because now you know what it's like to have a wildly unpopular opinion that everybody's like, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And so as a result, you feel like, am I wrong? I don't think I'm wrong. Fuck all of you guys.
Wait. What is that opinion in the context of you? Like shit?
For me, I would say it's Biden. I would say my perspectives on Biden have been universally disliked in the Twitch and YouTube political space. I would say that, what else? Also, back in the day, we had that discussion about like firearms. Where I was the firearms is more important than the Constitution.
Yeah.
And, I had, not that many people, but I had a few people share their negative opinion of my ideas on that. But anyways, neither here nor there. In reference to Hasan getting deported, one of the words
not deported. He wasn't deported.
God, I wish. So detained. So one of the things that I kept hearing you say in the clips that I did watch was viewpoint discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I heard.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm asking you in return is, if it wasn't a viewpoint discrimination bias, where if somebody who was simping for the IRA got detained, somebody who was simping for the Tamil Tigers, or, name another like terrorist org or whatever, then at that point, do you give a shit? Because I'll say, if Customs and Border Patrol is detaining people who simp for international terrorist orgs, and it's viewpoint not discriminate, I actually don't give a shit at all. I would prefer that my border controls do that.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. You're getting one level of generality removed from the way I'm looking at it. You're basically saying, well, if they treat all extremist groups like that, then we're okay, right? Because you're treating everyone the same. It actually kind of reminds me.
And by the way, I'm not saying the Trump admin is doing that. I'm saying if the Trump admin was doing that, would you care?
Yeah. So I don't view it as viewpoint discrimination in that context. I think that's potentially one level of viewpoint discrimination, which is as between alleged groups, right? Terrorist groups that have been designated as such. Are you treating everyone the same? I'm almost less concerned about that, right? The government is not required to deal with all of societal's ills in exactly the same way or with the same response. It could be, right? If this were not viewpoint discrimination, the way that I'll clarify later is what I mean, if this were no constitutional problem, maybe it's the government's contention that the Hezbollah Houthi terrorist problem is worse. And so, yeah, they're not treating all groups, equally, but why should they have to? Why should the government be forced to treat all of societal's ills the same way, or even if it's on the same kind of thing? Like what if the government, for example, was taking a step against incitement of violence or threats, but they had like a specific anti-Semitic task force, right? Because anti-Semitism incitement is like a worse problem now, and it's a particular kind of incitement issue that is like really bad. I don't even know necessarily that I would take issue with that kind of.
You're kind of offending my liberal universalist sympathies, but I do want to hear what you meant by viewpoint discrimination.
Yeah. So what I mean by viewpoint discrimination is in the designation itself, with respect to foreign terrorists, putting aside material support, the fact that you are treating people who support the specific group worse than people who don't support the specific group, that's the viewpoint description. Not as between different groups in the sense of different types of terrorist organizations, but as relates to supporters and versus non-supporters of the specific group. That's the viewpoint discrimination.
Why? So I'm confused then, and hopefully you can clarify. why wouldn't that be sufficient if that group was engaged in terrorist activity? So as an example, if I'm hearing you correct, what you're saying is that you actually wouldn't care. Let's say that there was somebody who supported the IRA, right? They said, oh, Irish Republican Army is based. Provisional IRA needs to come back. They need to start shooting SAS troops. Then you would actually say, well, the IRA is largely defunct and gone. So I don't know if I give a shit about barring somebody for entry back and forth based off of sympathy with the IRA, right? So you don't want to necessarily treat these terrorist orgs with the same level of care, because the IRA is nowhere near as active in the modern day as, let's say, Hamas or Hezbollah.
I'm basically saying,
but what's weird to me, though, is you're saying that there's a discrimination going on between the citizen who does not sympathize with Hezbollah and Hamas versus the citizen who does sympathize with Hezbollah and Hamas.
Right.
And for me, I would want the person who does sympathize with international terrorist orgs, particularly if they're traveling to Eurasia and back, to have a level of detention to see where they're coming from, who were they talking to, what did they do on their trip, and what are they doing coming back into the United States, and what are their plans when they come back into the United States? Because you don't want to have it where just because they're an American citizen, they can travel overseas, hang out with actual terrorists, get material support in plans for terrorism, and then plan an attack, but you didn't even ask them any questions because they're a citizen. That doesn't make any fucking sense, especially with birthright citizenship.
Well, I don't think that there's a basis to treat citizens differently on that basis, whether it's birthright citizenship or your parents are citizens. I don't really view a constitutional.
No, I'm just saying that people can be born here and not buy into all of America's virtues. That's all I'm saying.
People can be.
We don't.
People
we don't
can also be born to American parents.
Off of some espoused loyalty to the United States of America.
People can be born to American parents. I would argue that a lot of people born to American parents have that same exact thing, and I have no evidence of a tendency one way or the other in terms of their disloyal sentiments, and so I have no basis to say that we should treat them differently. Before we start on that, I think it's very interesting the points you bring up, and that there are those two levels of potential discrimination. One is discrimination as between different designated groups, and discrimination as between people who support a specific group and people who don't support a specific group. That's the viewpoint discrimination I'm talking about. But before that, factually, do you think it's more likely than not, what has turned out to be the case is Hasan's global entry was revoked before his trip? Okay? So the global entry was revoked before the trip. Okay? Before we have any evidence of a trip. Do you
actually to just throw this out? I don't know. I don't even fucking know what global entry is. So that's where
global entry is, like a program, like a trusted traveler program for the CBP, and it's kind of similar to TSA pre-check, but applying internationally. That when you come back from an international flight, you don't have as many screenings. It's much quicker. It's a quicker line. You've gone through a background check. You've submitted information, and they can revoke global entry for a lot of trivial shit. They can revoke it because you had a conviction. They can revoke it because you violated something one time, right? So there are a bunch of, even you might say, even trivial reasons why they could revoke, and it's a discretion-based system where you get this trusted traveler program. 100%. That's what global entry is. What we found out was, and the factual pattern here is, Hasan goes abroad, comes back, goes in the global entry line, and is stopped and questioned. What we found out is, and that's in May, thereabouts. In March, he received an email and letter, email attached in a letter, which he wasn't aware of when he went on his trip, that had revoked his global entry status. I believe, more likely than not, that revocation in March, prior to him going on a trip, was due to viewpoint discrimination. Do you have any inclination in terms of factually? I know that for these purposes, we're like arguing what if it were revoked for viewpoint discrimination. Do you have any prior or idea about what the likelihood is that his global entry, this trusted traveler program, was revoked because of viewpoint of things he said?
Well, in what I would say, I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, but what I would say is, if it's viewpoint discrimination, but the viewpoint that's espoused is sympathy to terrorist organizations,
right,
then I'm 100% okay with that revocation.
Okay. And that is because?
because people who sympathize with terrorist organizations are probably more likely to participate in terrorism themselves.
So would you be okay with people who sympathize with terrorists not having access to a state-issued driver's license? If a state passed a law that said people who sympathize with the Houthis aren't allowed to get car license, a license is a privilege. A driver's license is absolutely a privilege. Would you be okay with the constitutionality of that law? And would you support it?
I don't know about legality. My moral instinct would be that would be like an undue burden on a citizen of the United States.
I know, but that's, I mean, they're more likely to commit terrorism, right? If they sympathize with Houthis, a lot of terrorist attacks happen with the cars.
Sure. No, I think it would be to the degree, right? So for instance, like, let me think about this.
Yeah.
So from like a reasonableness standard, I think that you probably could revoke somebody's driver's license once they hit like a certain like we would have to use a reasonableness standard, right? So tweeting out "Free Palestine," I don't think it would be like sufficient grounds to revoke somebody's driver's license for terrorism sympathy. I don't even think that. What is it?
No, but someone says, for example, I agree with.
Well, I was going to give you another example. I was going to talk about the porn
attacks.
star. I was going to talk about Mia Khalifa and Frogan. I think even the shit that Mia Khalifa and Frogan, where they're like, "Turn your camera sideways, lol. I want to see you behead civilians." I don't even know if that is sufficient.
No, but what if someone says, "I have a political agreement when ISIS does the car attacks"? I think that's good. What if someone says those words exactly?
Yeah, then yeah. If somebody says like, car attacks are based, actually, yeah, revoke their driver's license. I'd be okay with that.
Yeah, I think that's dangerous.
Why not?
Because I think we have the First Amendment. And that would be, so based on your view, your political expression, your view that car attacks are based, and you agree with them politically for whatever your fucked up justifications, the government, on the basis of that view, that is, they wouldn't do this if you had the opposite view. If you thought it was horrible that people would use a car attack to kill a bunch of people, they would not treat you this way, and they're revoking this benefit.
Yeah, if you're saying I think that when people take vehicles and drive it into crowds of civilians, that's a good thing, then yeah, you should have your fucking car taken away.
I think that's classic. I think that's viewpoint discrimination. I think it shows that you don't value the First Amendment. And
why is it bad to be viewpoint discriminative?
Because I think it's anathema to the Constitution. Imagine if they said something like this.
How?
So imagine that someone releases a study and they find out, actually, Republicans are 5 times likelier to be involved in an accident. And so if you're a Republican and you try to get a license, you're not eligible.
No.
Why not?
You're this is like it's like Loki's wager. You know, you're saying you can't cut the head or the neck, therefore we can't make a discernment. No, we can make reasonable discernments. Matter of fact, this is something that's frustrating for me with the Kingslayer Damocles thing, and I'm going to bring this up again, even though we've already had this conversation, is you accept the fact that there are reasonableness standards for the Second Amendment, okay? There are plenty of people in this country, libertarians, conservatives, all that kind of stuff, who effectively believe that with the Second Amendment as written, you have no ability to legislate what kind of weapons they are able to bear or what weapons they are able to have. And yet, we have applied a reasonableness standard for the past like 200 and some odd years to the right to keep and bear arms. And so applying it to
I think you're wrong about that.
The First Amendment, I see as almost directly analogous.
The modern,
and I will not concede this.
The doctrine of
probably ever.
The Second Amendment doctrine is fairly new. It's recent, and it's actually a fairly
new, fairly recent. What the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, Heller's in 2008, 2009, and McDonald.
Okay, and there's been private firearms ownership the entire existence of the United States.
Yeah, I'm not saying that. We're talking about the doctrine here about what's allowed, what a state is allowed to restrict. A lot of states choose not to restrict it at all. So, but the modern doctrine here about what the line is in terms of what guns you can and can't have, or what the doctrine is there, the right to have the Second Amendment be applied as an individual right, that's fairly recent. So the 200 years thing is false. I'm just
okay, you
honest.
Can say that it's been affirmed fairly recently, but it was broadly understood to have civilian firearms ownership for centuries. You can't look at the 19th century and see adventurers traveling out across the Western Plains with 6 shooters on their hips and lever actions and shotguns and say there wasn't a presumed right to civilian firearms ownership.
No, that's different. What you're talking about is the states didn't.
How is it different?
Yeah, the states didn't regulate it as much back in the day. But the question is, does the Second Amendment, as understood, did the Second Amendment prevent those regulations if a state wanted to have those things? And some of the first restricted firearms laws were out of Texas and New York, and those laws were upheld, even though many accuse those laws of being racist. By the way, in retrospect, like the Texas laws, because they were scared of like newly freed blacks having weapons and that kind of thing. But I just want to say, the conception of the Second Amendment as a limitation on state authority, that is incredibly recent. The Second Amendment was only understood to be a limitation on federal authority. Yes. Why are you shaking your head like that?
Wait, because the Supremacy Clause. Because wasn't the Supremacy Clause in the late 19th century as well?
But the Second Amendment didn't apply. None of the Bill of Rights applied to the states at the initial founding of the country. Did you know that?
Are you forcing me to Google when the Supremacy Clause was established?
It's not the, no,
as a lawyer, I'm assuming you already know it. When was the Supremacy Clause established?
The Supremacy Clause is part of the initial Constitution. It's in Article 6. That's the Supremacy Clause.
Okay.
That says
when did the federal government assert that constitutional rights preempt state limitations?
So they've always preempted state
I'm
limitations.
almost 90% sure that it was after the Civil War.
Federal law has always been supreme. Federal law is always supreme.
Sure.
The question is, does the Second Amendment apply to state government action? So, for example, the First Amendment absolutely, positively did not apply to state governments. First Amendment says clearly, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech, blah, 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 blah. It directs its commentary to the federal government. What was the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights was proposed by states who were afraid of federal encroachment. The states who proposed the Bill of Rights, they weren't trying to limit state power. They were trying to limit federal power. And so Madison and the other members of these state governments, of these smaller states, they wanted to impose limitations on the federal government, not on the state governments. The notion that the Bill of Rights applied as to the state government is a fairly recent phenomenon. It has to do with the passage of the 14th Amendment.
Because listen, I'm just going to give you the narrative, and you can tell me whether or not it's right or wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
So the narrative that I remember, relatively speaking, is that you're right, that a lot of people originally translated that these were limits on the federal government, not on the state government. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, the states passed a whole bunch of laws that technically would have violated the Constitution of the United States, but it was at the state level, so nobody really gave a shit.
No. So it didn't apply. So it didn't apply. So states had their own religion.
Hold on. I'm not done with the narrative yet. I'm just giving you the narrative, and then you can debunk it in full. My understanding was that after the Civil War, effectively, it was kind of culturally understood that the states had become burdensome to the people to the point that they were depriving them of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so as a result, if even a state law violates the Constitution of the United States, the federal law, then it can be struck down.
The process is called...
Am I incorrect in that understanding?
I think it's not 100% on all fours. I think that the cultural shift is a big part of the different conception of the United States as being a singular as opposed to a plural. I think all that is correct. I think that the cauldron of the Civil War...
So do you agree with like states' right, Confederate, like neo-Confederate states' rights advocates who basically say that the federal government is overstepping whenever it declares a state law unconstitutional, and states actually have the right to affect their own happiness?
What was your question about that?
If a state law is unconstitutional, it can stand?
So what are you asking me with respect to the nullification theories? What are you asking me? Do I recognize that people have those theories?
Let's say that a state government straight up just violates the First Amendment. They say you don't have a right to freedom of speech and freedom of conscience inside the state of Tennessee. And so as a result, if you violate a local blasphemy law, you say, God damn it, in public, a cop can walk up and arrest you.
Yeah.
Okay. So what's going to happen is somebody is going to say, God damn it, in public. They're going to get arrested. They're going to get taken to court. And I'm assuming that they're going to appeal it as being violative of the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. So what I'm asking you, Pisco the lawyer, is that law, even though it's clearly violative of the First Amendment, will it be upheld because it's at the state level, or is it going to be struck down because it violates the federal?
Today?
Yes.
It will be struck down.
When did that cultural transition shift?
So there's a specific case. I think the case is
My understanding was it was after the Civil War.
I'm trying to answer your question. It is
I'm open to other
you are correct that it's after Civil War. I'm trying to explain it to you. So for the First Amendment, it was a gradual process. I think the case is called Gitlow. Thank you very much for the raid. Sorry, I haven't changed the raid sound, so it's going to be for another 30 seconds. So I'm just going to filibuster. This is Counterpoints. ICO rules. Is this the real ICO rules? Is this the actual ICO rules? The real ICO? I don't know if it's a real ICO. Anyway, this is Counterpoints from Valor Media Entertainment. Is that right? Valor Media Entertainment?
Valor Media Network.
Valor Media Network. It's an offshoot of Midas Touch. Just a bunch of guys, a couple girls, a lot of guys, mostly guys, talking about each other, looking at each other, a bunch of guys, ex-military guys, people who are already Republicans, a lot of bros, dudes.
Lots of bro hugs.
You should follow Valor Media Entertainment. You should also follow ICO Rules. Thank you for the raid. ICO Rules. Where were we? Yeah. So it was a process called incorporation. The First Amendment case, I believe the case that incorporates the First Amendment as to apply the states is a case called Gitlow. I think that's the name of the case, and that's from I think the 1920s. But it's a gradual process, and yes, it happened after the Civil War, and I think related to it is a cultural shift for sure. So I'm not saying that you're wrong, that there was a massive cultural shift post-Civil War, that the conception of the country as being these disparate sovereigns as opposed to one country and nationhood was a big component to the legal underpinning theories. So I'm not telling you you're wrong about that, but there actually is a legal rationale here, which is that the 14th Amendment, when it speaks of due process of law, that the state shall not deprive persons of due process of law, shall not deprive people of liberty, right, without due process of law, that liberty, what it was doing is incorporating notions of liberty, including beyond just your physical freedom, but also the kind of Bill of Rights freedoms that apply to the federal government. When you're talking about the nullification theories that existed in the states, you're correct about those theories. Those theories absolutely were true, but there's kind of two parts of that. One is the question, does the Bill of Rights even constrain the states at all? And the answer for everyone was no. It didn't, up until this new theory of incorporation. And there was a second related question, which is, can the federal courts, does the Supreme Court, is their interpretation binding on the state courts? And that's a second question, which is like, are we bound by the federal court's determinations as to what the federal law even means in the first place? And so in the pre-Civil War era, there was unanimity from both the federal and the state courts and everybody that these rights of the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. Afterwards, but there was also a difference of opinion about whether the Supreme Court's pronouncements on the law were binding on the state courts. The Supremacy Clause clearly says that they are, just to be clear. So I agree the Supremacy Clause looms large over this, but this incorporation of the Bill of Rights happens selectively and gradually over time. And so
so let's cut to it in reference to Hasan.
The gun rights. Well, let's do gun rights. I want to finish on gun rights real quick, and then I want to touch on Hasan. So specifically for gun rights, the McDonald case, or I should say the Heller decision, the first decision was DC, because of course the Second Amendment applies to the federal government, and this was a DC law that banned handguns in DC. And there had to be a separate case called McDonald, which then incorporated that individual right as applied to the federal government to apply to the state governments as well. And that's why we have the modern doctrine. It's all a way of me saying this is a fairly modern phenomenon. And yes, there is a standard for the Second Amendment that not all gun laws are per se unacceptable, right? Scalia made a carve out for law, you can restrict firearms for felons and for people with mental problems. And then that's been clarified later on especially in the recent case, the Bruin case, that there can be certain kinds of restrictions, but it's kind of limited. It's kind of historical test. And they're kind of like, it's a very strong right, the Second Amendment, but it seems like you're willing to give up the First Amendment just because someone voices support for a terrorist group that does car attacks. And
how is getting temporarily detained and interrogated about where you've been and what you've done, how is that equivalent to the complete violation of the First Amendment? And then also, how is sympathizing with car attacks eliminating the First Amendment right to say, you can say whatever the fuck you want, but you can walk, you can catch a ride, you can get an Uber, but we're not going to enable you to carry out a terrorist attack.
The First Amendment is not just whether or not you can be physically constrained, right? So for example, you would say it's a First Amendment problem if the government said, we're only going to give Social Security to Democrats. You would be like, well, that's a problem. You wouldn't say, well, we're not saying Democrats are going to be imprisoned. You can still walk around. We just don't want to give Social Security benefits to people who don't appreciate them and who don't work, and they're much more likely to be Democrats. You would say that law is still a First Amendment issue because even
I
though
feel like you're doing Loki's wager again.
it's not Loki's wager. It's not Loki's wager. So I'm not a
Yeah, it is.
I'm not saying that there's
an infinitely more reasonable within the spectrum of things that we're talking about. Okay, let's say that I come out on social media and I say I fucking love car attacks. Okay, I think that loading up a U-Haul with cinder blocks and then recreating the Bastille Day thing, I think everybody should be doing that all of the time.
Yeah.
Because did you hear there's a genocide in Gaza?
Speech. It's a protected speech.
Then it's protected speech. You can say whatever the fuck you want. But if the federal government wanted to come out with some kind of prohibition where it said that if you publicly proclaim that you sympathize with like terrorist attacks, then we can revoke, or state government.
We can
if they
revoke
said
your
that we
benefits,
can revoke your driver's license and we can revoke your right to rent a U-Haul, I would find that pretty reasonable.
What about revoking your ability to get any kind of government entitlement, government benefits, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? Would you be okay with that?
I don't know how you would justify that because you're trying to effectively like prevent a crime. I don't know how like prohibiting you from
that's what I mean. The First Amendment
getting a social entitlement is somehow gonna like enhance the public good.
Yeah, so these kinds of legal principles aren't just based on our priors about what's in the public interest. What you're describing is kind of like what the democratically accountable branches should be doing. They should be taking into this consideration like what's in the public good. The courts should be trying to apply some legal principles that are repeatable to certain analyses. And sometimes there's going to be hard cases where it's like you said, right? No one's going to be able to define exactly what is reasonable or what is this or that. But there are some clear cases where the court has told us it's not okay to punish on the basis of this. One example, right, is you cannot, even if it's just a government benefit that you're giving out to people, you can't base who's getting the benefit on like their political affiliations, right? You can't just say communists are more likely to be disloyal. And so because they're more likely to be disloyal, anyone who professes communism is just simply not allowed to get benefits from the government. They're not allowed to do that. And likewise,
shit, I wish.
Yeah, you wish. So, but like, why are you so?
I wish. I'm not saying it's good.
I know, but you would never say in the Second Amendment. If someone said, "I wish we could ban guns," you would be like, "Fuck you," and the horse you rode in on, because you value the Second Amendment more than you value the First Amendment. Just be honest about that.
No. Let me try to differentiate this.
Mm-hmm.
As an example, I would actually be wildly interested to hear your perspective on this. By the way, so assault. Right, in the state of Florida, is classified as effectively making like an utterance that can be viewed as a threat that could be imminent. And so as a result, merely articulating a threat in the presence of another person is a crime that can get you incarcerated. And so I would view this as a reasonable limitation on the First Amendment because effectively, what is it? It's like Congress shall pass no laws abridging the freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Right. Well, this is a law abridging the freedom of speech. But I see it as a reasonable one, and we allow it to stand. I'm pretty sure in every state within the union, you can be, if it's battery is typically striking, assault is typically threatening, at least in the state of Florida. So for me, what I'm asking is, what is the legal logic behind prohibiting threatening someone within, like an imminent action?
Yeah.
Versus why is that not an abridgment of the freedom of speech?
Yeah,
that's my question.
So there's a bunch of, the way the courts analyze this is they first have a question, is this even speech? That's the first question. Is this even, so for example, driving drunk is not speech. And so the first funnel they go down is.
But I think we agree that a threat and Hasan's social media posts are speech.
I agree. I'm just trying to be comprehensive. So the first funnel is this speech or is it not speech? If it's not speech, if it's not expressive conduct in some way, that's why burning the flag can be considered expressive conduct, because speech is not just
because it's a kind of art.
Right. So we go into speech category. Okay. If it's speech, is it in a category of unprotected speech? Categories of unprotected speech are often based in history. So for example, defamation has never been protected speech. So even though it is speech to defame someone, it is expressive conduct. Everyone understood that the English common right, right of speech, did not include defamation, and that defamation is not protected. Now, defamation has specific elements, but if you can show those elements, right, if you can prove something is defamation, there's no free speech issue with defamation. Now, there's some First Amendment standard in defamation, which has to do with like the public figure doctrine. But if you're able to meet those standards, it's a category of unprotected speech. I'll pause right there if you have a question.
What about obscenity?
Yeah, so obscenity is another category of unprotected speech. Obscenity, it's a kind of sliding scale standard a little bit, which has to do with, there's a case, now I'm not remembering the name. Someone will be able to, I think it's a Miller case, the Miller test for, if you search Miller test, you might get the obscenity test. But that basically is a category of unprotected test. If you're able to meet the test for that category, that it's offensive to like whatever the test is, whatever the Miller test is, it has no artistic value, that kind of stuff, then it's obscenity and it's unprotected speech. And then you can ban it, right? Then you can ban it. You can ban defamation if you wanted to. We could criminalize defamation if we wanted to. We could criminalize obscenity, and we do criminalize some forms of obscenity. So child pornography is another category of unprotected speech. Harassment, right?
Sure.
That's a category of unprotected speech, and they have their own test. Fighting words is a category of unprotected speech. And then incitement is a category of unprotected speech. And material support is a category of unprotected speech. Material support for a terrorist organization is a category of unprotected speech. So you look to the categories, you see, does any of the categories of unprotected speech apply? And if so, then we can ban it. Then we can do all kinds of restrictions, right? So you could, if you wanted to, say, well, if you do harassment.
For the Miller test, though, yeah. I just Googled it real quick. It looks like it's almost exclusively sexual.
Obscenity is for sexual stuff, generally.
Then, I guess what my question is,
it needs to appeal to the prurient interest,
So what about, I guess that's, I was using obscenity colloquially, which I think is like offensive to the common morality or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's not obscenity.
Right. Yeah. So definitionally, since praising terrorism isn't sexual,
it would not be. Yeah. So
it's not obscenity.
Obscenity appeals to the prurient interest, the sexual interest, the kind of titillating interest.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah. So just because a statement is offensive, it needs to be like patently offensive and also appealing to the this kind of perverse sexual desire. Yeah. So that's obscenity. You have to make sure that it fits one of these tests. And if it fits one of these tests, then it's unprotected speech. We don't have a test that cleanly maps on. The closest one would be like material support for a terrorist organization. But that requires more than what, like just saying, for example, in our hypotheticals, I think that this attack in Paris is great or the Nice attack is great, wouldn't be enough to material support.
That's actually, I should ask instead of stating. Is there any unprotected speech? So, for instance, you said fighting words was a category of unprotected speech. You said obscenity was a category of unprotected speech, which actually bans child pornography based. We understand that child
pornography is even more of a categorical unprotected than obscenity. Child pornography, you have to prove different things to make something child pornography. And so it's a different category altogether, and it's even less protected than obscenity.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So then my question is there any obscenity equivalent for violence established in the United States, or is the only one fighting words?
Incitement would be the closest. So incitement is the Brandenburg standard. So you're allowed to say horribly offensive. Standard. So if you look up Brandenburg standard, it's Ohio v. Brandenburg.
Okay.
And this is like
yeah. I'm listening.
Yeah, so that's the closest one. In America, guess what? You're allowed to say offensive shit. You're allowed to say deeply immoral, offensive shit. You're allowed to, for example, picket the funeral of dead soldiers and say that your sons are going to hell. You remember the Westboro Baptist Church?
You won. Pisco, I'm just gonna say it. You won.
Hey.
You won. Okay, and I'll explain it. So I am particularly sensitive to the topic of jihadism as somebody who was born in the late 80s. When I was a teenager, I watched people jump out of buildings to their deaths for 3 hours in middle school. The teachers didn't turn off the television. They literally let us watch hundreds of people commit suicide for 3 or 4 hours. I enlisted in the military as a result of that action. And when I was overseas, while I didn't participate in anything specifically horrible myself, we still got mortared occasionally. And also there were horrific crimes that were committed in the city of al-Baghdadi while I was in country, and there were, which was outside of my base. And there was also specifically horrific crimes that were committed to other folks in different jurisdictions. So I'm kind of like very sensitive to jihadist terrorism, like very sensitive. However, I do think that ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to preserve the Republic of the United States, and one of its most endearing principles is freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. And so if there's a legal categorization that already covers violence, obscenity, all that kind of stuff, I'm not going to like whole cloth create a new category of violent speech that offends me, therefore we're going to do it. Because then we're talking about video games, movies, talking shit on the internet, all that kind of stuff. I would be in violation of this law all the time because I would say, I'm coming to kick your ass.
People could say,
in a joking
about
manner.
Hate speech, right? People say hate speech. Is that a sound of thunder? I don't know. Lightning. People say hate speech, right? That should be unprotected. But hate speech is not a category of unprotected speech, historically understood in America, or one that's
so I would rather defer to freedom.
Okay, perfect.
Over my own sensibilities, I would rather defer to freedom.
Let me give you one caveat, which is it is possible, even if you're in a category of protected speech, for two kind of things. There's intermediate levels of scrutiny if it's a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. So when we're not saying you can't say this, you're just saying you have to apply for a permit to do this kind of demonstration in the park. The park closes after 10 o'clock. You can't be shouting after 8 o'clock to disturb the peace. So there's some intermediate scrutiny applied to things that aren't viewpoint-based discrimination. It's like reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And there you have a kind of reasonability test that is incorporated there. And then there's another thing. Even if it is protected speech, even if it's political protected speech, and political speech, it's unclear whether it's there's a doctrinal difference, but typically the courts have said political speech is the most protected speech, and they add a little gloss to it. Even if it's political protected speech, there's this concept known as strict scrutiny, where even if it's viewpoint discrimination, sometimes the need for the government is so great, it's such a compelling purpose, and the way that we're structuring is so narrow that we're going to allow it anyway. So an example, but it needs to really be at the utmost, right? So imagine an example of this could be the following. Let's say that we were under a pandemic. Oh, no one can hear you.
Sorry, quick interjection. Yeah. One of the things that I found was advocation for criminality. And I think that is a limit that I'm perfectly accepting of. Sorry, please continue.
But again, it needs to meet incitement, right? So mere advocacy.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure it's a higher bar than
you need to have proximity. But you need to have intent. You need to have all this stuff. Now, it's different if you're just talking about a criminal conspiracy, or you're seeing someone commit a crime and you're giving them words of encouragement. That's unprotected. That can be accomplice liability. That's unprotected speech. But abstract calls for criminality is protected. It just can't meet abstract calls.
Why?
Because it is. I don't know what to tell you, because historically that's understood. So if you say that I support people doing theft, generally it's my belief that theft is morally justifiable, that's protected speech. Now, if you see a theft taking place, you say, yeah, go do it. Yeah, do this right now. And you have that immediacy in the intent.
So that's
different.
Okay, I want to listen, and then I want to poke. So say what you were going to say, and then I'm going to poke.
Okay. Put all that aside. For some protected speech, if the need is great enough, if there's a compelling purpose, and if it's narrowly tailored, the government will allow this kind of viewpoint discrimination. But it is a super, super hard test, and almost nothing will meet. You'd have to come up with a crazy situation, crazy scenario. So let's say that you were actually able to prove something like 99% of people who espouse the Al-Qaeda belief, that there's a 99%, like if we know that they do the Al-Qaeda belief, if they say that, they're going to do the bomb. And you were able to prove that statistically. My guess is the courts would say, okay, even though it's protected speech.
Well, so why isn't it more loose than that? So for instance, this is where I'm going to prod you.
Yeah.
So as an example, I can go back into Hasan Piker's coterie of streams, and I can see the blood of capitalists should run red in the streets. I can see America deserved 9/11. I can see a brave mujahideen fucked the eye hole out of a sitting congressman. I can see I think I already said America deserved 9/11, but I think that's pretty bad. I can see 10 toes down, I stand with the Houthi terrorists. I can see his interview with the Houthi propagandist. I can see him effectively spending hours dancing around whether or not Hamas and Islamic Jihad are allowed to target civilian Israelis. I can see all of this stuff that, in my opinion, off of the totality of facts, the totality of circumstances, this is someone who at minimum supports terrorism himself, and at maximum, he's trying to propagandize the American population into believing that extrajudicial violence against civilians in the name of a political objective is acceptable. And so in like a violence kind of thing, this is obscene to me. I'm actually upset that obscenity doesn't cover violence, but it is what it is. It might be Pandora's box when it comes to law.
Yeah.
So at what point do we hit a threshold where we can detain and interrogate somebody when they travel overseas? And also at what threshold do we hit where instead of like immaterial support, it becomes material?
Like independent advocacy. Yeah, so here I wouldn't argue about the materiality. I'd just say this is independent advocacy. I think it's a pretty once you can show that like
but what is material? Like you have to hand somebody an AK?
It's low. It's a low level of materiality. You have to look at Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project.
Chat?
What's that?
You have to you give $5 to the Hamas YouTube channel? Like what's the
I think that if you were to give
when I hear material, I hear like money, logistics, weapons. Yeah. That's what I hear.
So I don't know the exact dollar value, but so for example, if you knew that you were let's say you're like a vendor of, I don't know, pins or something, or you're a vendor of something in this terrorist organization, like in where this terrorist organization operates, and you're like selling, I don't know, burritos or something, or pins, and you happen to know that they're terrorist organizations, but it's $1, $2 pro forma transactions for something, but you're selling to a terrorist, and it's probably going to help them in some way, right? I would say the materiality bar is like a low threshold. What we're talking about here is
so I guess my question is, I know that you're trying to explain a lot of things, but the question that I'm asking is, speech is valuable, right? I get paid hundreds, if not thousands of dollars monthly in order to
talk. By Progressive Victory PAC.
Yeah, so at what point does advocacy not become some level of material support? And my question is pointed because Anwar al-Awlaki was a United States citizen overseas who effectively became an al-Qaeda propagandist. And at some point, that was viewed as important enough to take his life.
Yeah, so I think it would be illegal to take his life on the basis of his just his independent advocacy. The problem is, so independent advocacy never.
Well, but it's dependent advocacy because he's hanging out with terrorists.
That's what I mean, right? So it's not independent advocacy on Anwar al-Awlaki's part. He's actually engaging in war against the United States, and it's not independent, right? So what we're talking about is independent advocacy doesn't ever become material support. That's what the Supreme Court said in Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. So you can say whatever you like. Connor
but can I argue that if Hasan is, platforming, people who are members of the Ansar Allah movement, that is dependent advocacy?
So I want to be clear about something. That I think it would depend on the situation, right? That maybe is the close. If you could prove, right, that he is platforming with the intent to help the Houthis, and that he knows this person is a Houthi.
I think that's strongly arguable.
And I think that you would have to have a way to separate out the category of journalists, like good
public
faith
interest.
Yeah, public interest, good faith journalism, because you don't want to include there, right? Like, would you say the New York Times, when they publish an article by "This is why we hate you," or "This is why," like, they're publishing some statement made by, or like when they go to Osama bin Laden to interview them, are they giving material support?
Yeah, but that's what I mean. There's an intent level there that we can infer, which is basically the New York Times is trying to inform, whereas I would argue the Hasan Piker is trying to support. And I think I could substantiate that with evidence.
So I think that case, even in those cases, you have to make space for the legitimate journalistic, and it can't just be, for example, it can't just be having like a softball interview. I think it legitimately needs to be like something else in that, and even then, I think like a one-off interview.
I would expect it to be a stretch.
I think it's a bit of a stretch.
I would expect it to be a stretch.
I can't say that we have on-point precedent for that exact situation, but I would argue strenuously that the conduct that, as described about this Houthi kid, who, by the way, they say he's Houthi. I don't know. I don't have any evidence of that. They say it. wouldn't meet the bar for me. I'm just telling you where I would draw the line. It wouldn't include that kind of thing. Now, if there were repeated contacts, yes, you tell me what the message is, I'll come and spread it, and we're talking about communications. Okay, now we have something different. You asked a question, which is like, how much grace will I give to someone to stop someone at the border, ask them questions? The only part of this is like, yeah, there's a exception to the Fourth Amendment in terms of detainments at the border for people coming into the border. You don't really need probable cause or any reason really to stop someone if you're just going through like just generic security question, that kind of stuff. It's an exception to the warrant requirement. It's an exception to probable cause when you're at the border. But even in that context, you can't do viewpoint discrimination, right? So another example is like, you can't do racial discrimination at the border, even though there's an exception to the warrant requirement, probable cause. You can't stop someone because they're black, right? You can't stop someone because they're a Muslim. Agreed. Now, there could be limited instances in which you could use their race or their religion as part of an identification rationale. If you know that the person coming across who's the target is a Muslim and it's part of what you're looking at to identify them, very different. If you're using the race because of something unconnected to like stereotypes or traits necessary or perceived that are related to them being black, also, again, very different. What we're talking about here is on the basis of this protective trait or this protected speech in this context, if you're doing the stop, notwithstanding the fact that you have wide discretion to stop people, even sometimes for no reason, you can't do it based on an impermissible reason. That's what I think was being done at the point of revocation.
So nail this down for me, though.
Yeah.
So as an example, this might be a bad example, but I'm going to use it anyways. When you're driving down the road, right, you have like less Fourth Amendment rights effectively than if you're in a domicile, right?
That's correct.
And I think the courts have affirmed this multiple times.
For multiple
like plain
reasons.
view doctrine
For multiple reasons, because homes are constitutionally enumerated in the Fourth Amendment. They give extra gloss to constitutionally enumerated places. So homes, papers, persons, and effects. And because there's this exception that it's called the vehicle exception to the warrant requirement for vehicle searches.
Yeah, it's like simultaneously it's private because it's yours, but it's public because it's traveling on a public roadway. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, part of it is like plain view doctrine, which is effectively if you can see it, if a cop can see it,
is a complete
they
exception.
can take action.
Yeah. Plain view is an exception, but in the context of a vehicle stop, you don't even need plain view. If you have probable cause that he has drugs in the car, you don't need a warrant. It's an exception to the warrant requirement.
Well, right. So hold on, but right here, let's play with drugs because that's where I was going. So as an example, with articulation, like cops oftentimes have a broad degree of latitude with reasonableness being articulated, but unfortunately for the civilian population, reasonableness has been so well articulated over time that cops come up with like 3 or 4 reasons for why they can get into a car. And lazy cops in particular just put that into every report, regardless of whether or not it's observed. Right. So like glassy eyes, furtive gestures, like all that kind of random crap.
Right.
They'll use as a pretext in order to support a search, and then they'll do a search. So my question is, at what point, because a furtive gesture is not in and of itself sufficient to grant a search. Glassy eyes is not in and of itself. Some people can have allergies. That's not in and of itself enough to grant a search. It's the totality of observable circumstances that allow you to grant a search.
Right.
And so my question is, we have all the behaviors that I brought up before, all of the 9/11, Brave Mujahideen, capitalist blood. At what point do those protected speech characteristics become the furtive gestures and the glassy eyes of a legal detention at the border?
I think you could probably consider First Amendment protected speech in a totality of circumstances test. It's possible. But when it's the sole basis, I don't think it's ever enough. If you're just adding more First Amendment speech, so I'll give you an example, right? So an example of this is under FISA, right? If we have evidence that you met with Russians, that you have communicated with people we know to be Russian agents, that you were employed by someone you know to have affiliations with the Russian government, none of those are speech related. None of that's viewpoint discrimination. But let's say we add on top of that cake, you've come out in favor of Russian policy positions. Maybe we can use that as part of the cake, so to speak, of a FISA application. So that's protected speech, but you're using that to make inferences about this person's likelihood to be an agent of a foreign power, and it's not the sole basis. The sole basis isn't this person's First Amendment speech, and it's not viewpoint discrimination. You're using it as part.
What would you use? Yeah. I want you to put on the investigator or prosecutor's hat real quick. Let's say that you're an asshole like me, and you dislike Hasan Piker intensely. And so you don't know whether or not you're going to uncover a crime, but you basically want to stop him at the border in order to detain him and interrogate him in order to make sure, excuse me, and your basis is reasonable, which is effectively you don't want him to go talk to terrorists overseas and then get like recruited into some network and then actually become a terrorist. You actually want to prevent a terrorist attack because you feel like he's overly sympathetic. And you know this about him before he even hits the border. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we have the constitutionally protected speech, which and you've said that I've already presented evidence, but it's redundant because it's protected. So that's not sufficient in order to detain him and interrogate him.
Yeah.
So my question is,
so if there were
what
evidence,
else would you use?
So if there's evidence that when he was on his trip, he met with someone we know to be a Houthi in person someplace, right?
But what if he just went to France and there just happens to be a lot of Muslims in France? Because you're not going to know every single person that somebody meets when they go to a foreign country.
Again, that to me is not going to be enough, because if all he's doing is associating people with a particular view, with who's of a certain faith, I don't think that's enough.
And by the way, we're not talking about like a warrants process. We're just talking about like an interview.
Yeah, we're not talking about warrant.
Like a border interview.
Yeah, you don't need to get a warrant because this is not a. Now it's shady what they're doing because they're using the fact that it's at the border. They're using the fact that it's at its border to go around the warrant and probable cause requirements. But I agree, you don't need a warrant and probable cause. The question is.
My question is, even if it's shady and unethical, is it legal?
I don't think it's legal to base a detainment solely on protected speech or protected speech plus he is in a place where Muslims exist. Now, if he's going to... Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. If he's going to a country...
You go.
If he went to Yemen, the fact that he's going to Yemen and has had these contacts and, with this alleged Houthi guys, and if they develop that a little bit more, and that he's had these pro-Houthi views, I think it's a different case. And there, I don't take it to be a viewpoint discrimination when they stop him. Sir, you were just in Yemen, right? You were just in Yemen, and we know that you're sympathetic to the Houthis. Why were you in Yemen? That I don't take to be viewpoint discrimination, because I think there's an investigation as to material support. And I think a criminal investigation into material support, it doesn't have to be a high threshold, right? Sorry, it's a very, very low threshold. And at the border, you don't need to have a warrant or probable cause, but you have to have a basis other than just the First Amendment protected speech.
Okay, let me follow this up a different way though, because as far as I know,
wait. Sorry. I just want to pause one more time. Very important. The global entry revocation happened before he traveled. And that's very important.
Sure.
That the revocation happened before he's traveled means you can't take anything he did in these other countries into your analysis at that point, right? Because he hasn't gone there. And so there can't be any evidence of him meeting with, unless there's evidence that he was planning to meet a Houthi there. There's no evidence that you can, because the deprivation allegedly happened at the point of revocation and then continued into the stop when they denied the global entry.
What, when he was leaving the United States?
So he was denied global entry in March. He was detained in May after he left the country, not knowing he got into the global entry line. And presumably, if you got into the global entry line after the global entry is revoked...
Is global entry... I mean, the word entry is in it. So I'm assuming it only happens when you come back in.
Right, it only happens when you come back in. Right, yeah. So at that point, they stopped him. And so that to me indicates that the deprivation happened before he traveled. And so it's not based on stuff that he's doing abroad, because the revocation happened, before that.
Okay, so I want to ask one more question, and then I want to specify your argument. So if this happens, though, where the United States government effectively detains somebody, interrogates them about their whatever, like I've had this happen. Obviously, like what is it? Like customs agents do this when you're coming into the country, even if it's not a detention with a further interview.
Correct.
Right? They say, can I see your passport? What's the reason for your stay? Is it business or pleasure? How long do you plan on staying here? Blah 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 blah. And I'm pretty sure, like, when I was traveling from Europe
to
the United States.
They ask you why did you go abroad,
that happened,
right?
but bear in mind this was 20 years ago. This was like 20 years ago.
I've never been asked why are you coming to the United States if you're a U.S. citizen. Maybe you've been
not
asked
if you're
why did you leave, right? Like why did you leave? Yeah.
Correct.
By the way,
correct.
This is a different analysis for non-citizens because I take non-citizens at the point of entry legally not to have any First Amendment rights to assert as to that, but that's just
so
legal.
For clarification, even if it's not necessarily material, when we were going to a European nation, we were asked why we were going, how long we were staying, et cetera, and then we were coming back to the United States. They didn't ask you why you're coming back. They're like, welcome home.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But they will ask you about your trip and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
are you bringing anything into the country that we should know about? Have you declared everything? That kind of shit. Yeah.
Right. Which we don't view as unlawful, and we generally speaking,
and you don't need a reason for it. You don't need a,
So my question is, let's say that somebody engages in what you're calling viewpoint discrimination, and they're using constitutionally protected speech as a reason to detain somebody and do a further detention and interrogation.
Yeah, as the motivation. As a motivation.
My question to you is, how would anybody ever fight that if there's broad discretion for border control to conduct these interrogations?
How would you practically prove it?
Or even if you could prove it, what would be the result? Because even if you were saying like, oh, you're engaged in viewpoint discrimination, then they could just say, well, we interrogated you because we fucking felt like it because you're at a border of the United States.
One of the reasons why it's very hard to imagine this going to like a court case is like, how would you cognize it? A lot of times the remedy for these kinds of violations is an exclusion of evidence in some kind of proceeding. So, right, if there's an illegal search, what is the remedy beyond, okay, if we were to charge you, you would exclude the evidence of fruit of the poisonous tree, right? So the amount of the courts have narrowed the kinds of remedies you can get for these kinds of deprivations. I'm not saying that Hasan would have no case whatsoever, but I don't know. It would be very limited. What are the damages?
Yeah, what would he get? Like, a couple $1,000 for the inconvenience or some shit, and he would spend more on lawyers' fees?
Yeah, and these cops all have qualified immunity anyway if you were to go after them for their in their personal capacity. So it's hard to see this case. Like, this case would have a lot of problems for reasons unrelated to the deprivation. But just because it's not cognizable in court for a bunch of reasons unrelated to the deprivation doesn't mean it's not a deprivation. And there could be contexts in which it could come up. For example, if you were charged as a result of evidence obtained based on that stop. And there could be evidence that you could present, for example, which is you call to testify the person who made the decision to revoke his global entry. And you ask him, like, why did you revoke his global entry? Now, in practicality,
and he could say, I literally don't remember. He could be like, I keyed in something that evidence, right? Alludes to this thing.
Maybe there's some email that there's a leaker, right, who revealed, just like these fucking whistleblowers, and they say, listen, I was in that call. I know that they were saying, who are the big lefties who support Hamas, and Hasan's name was brought up, and we looked at his clips, and so I know that this was the basis. And so such evidence could exist. But that's what I'm acknowledging you. The evidentiary problem in a case might be difficult, but here there's so much circumstantial evidence, in my opinion, that this is exactly what the motivation was. Now, would it be sufficient in any kind of case? I'm not sure.
So let me. This might help us nail down the controversy then, and then it might actually allow us to break a little bit of bread. So the controversy, I suppose, is that you're defending Hasan at all.
Yeah,
I'm assuming that's the controversy.
That is the controversy.
That you steelmanned his position, and you said that viewpoint discrimination and his protected speech is not sufficient grounds to detain him.
Correct.
I'm assuming that's why you're catching shit.
There's two things that people say. Well, they'll say it obviously wasn't viewpoint discrimination, or there's no evidence that it was viewpoint discrimination. They'll say that. Or if it was, it's based because he made these threats to the senator, or because of what you say, like he said all this shit about the Houthis. And so people will take, or that it was just, so in the camp one are the people who say it was completely random, or there's no evidence for us to conclude that there was viewpoint discrimination, or it was based on some other legitimate ground. And then camp two are people who say, it is viewpoint discrimination, but that viewpoint discrimination is justified either legally or morally.
Okay. I would say that I fell into the latter camp up until this conversation, and my moral instincts are still within that camp, but I don't think that that is like sufficient in order to completely eliminate like the concept of the Constitution or free speech or whatever. And I think one of the things that actually probably expanded my understanding of the First Amendment is you specifying protected versus unprotected speech.
Yeah.
Because as an example, when I actually did not know, even as a cop, I didn't know what gave me the authority to arrest somebody for assault, like fighting words.
Yeah.
I didn't, like, I knew that fighting words, I knew the term fighting words. I knew that I could detain somebody. I knew that I could arrest somebody, and I knew I could get a conviction, and I knew how I could evidence that conviction. However, I did not even get educated on the category of protected versus non-protected speech and its subclassifications.
Just to be clear, I think that assault is its own category. Fighting words a little bit more narrow. It has to do because for assault, it's the common law definition is like putting someone in fear of a reasonable apprehension of an offensive touching or something like that, right? Or like, and there's different gradations and states define it very differently. But you're generally correct in what you just said. I just want to put out there that fighting words is a little bit even more narrow. And so I know that you're using fighting words to describe a broader set of conduct. But if people call you on that, just be like, oh, I just mean assault. Yeah. But fighting words specifically.
Well, no, I also. Yeah, this is so. I'm not going to concede it. But I'm still going to hold my morality for it. But in reference to Mahmoud Khalil, I can actually see your position more clearly.
Yeah.
Because with Mahmoud Khalil, I think that, aliens, visitors to this country should have like a higher degree of scrutiny on their behavior and potentially participating or whatever in protests that support a terrorist organization. I still think falls under category 7 of whatever that deportable aliens thing was. However, I do see what you're saying, where the First Amendment, similar to the Second Amendment, similar to the Fourth Amendment, does not specify between citizens and non-citizens. It says people.
Yeah.
And then therefore, if there's non-protected speech versus protected speech, then you need to have some kind of caveat for how you're not violating the Constitution if you're deporting someone for what is constitutionally protected speech.
Yeah,
I see what you're saying legally.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and but I do want to arm you a little bit because I don't want to overstate the case. You could find a basis to distinguish First Amendment for citizen, non-citizen. There is at least one case that has done that in some things, but it's based on a kind of immigration maximalism, immigration plenary authority argument. And so that argument could possibly still go through. I don't agree with it. I don't think it will go through, but I'm just telling you, just be aware that it's not. Go ahead.
Well, and morally, just to shore up the people who were like, no, Connor, you were base, don't concede shit, fuck Pisco. Like, just to shore that perspective up. I still think that it's like morally suicidal or spiritually suicidal to invite your enemies in and not have any kind of capacity for kicking them out, for advocating for destroying your country.
That's the second part. That's the second part, which is legally you're going to have to concede that there's a distinction between letting them in and kicking them out while they're here. And if there are any rights for people coming into the country, they're very few. There's no due process rights for people who are applying to come into the country. There are due process rights when you're in the country. But at the point of entry, right, the government can just say, get the fuck out. We're not having a hearing, just leave, right? So it's very different kind of posture.
And the only thing that I want to caveat to what you just stated is the fact that the deportable aliens references inadmissible aliens for terrorism specifically.
Yeah, so it applies the same definitions.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
I gotta bounce in a second. But
no, I was actually gonna say the same thing. I probably need to cover some content and then dip out. However, I was gonna say I'm apologizing to the chat. Normally, Pisco and I are oil and water, and we're dogs and cats, and we're fucking fighting and screaming at each other. Unfortunately, what he said today made too much sense, so it was ultimately undeniable. So even if my moral instincts remain the same, where I want to be a chud piece of shit and kick Mahmoud Khalil out of the fucking country, I have to concede that there's ultimately this concept that I didn't really keep in my mind of legally protected versus unprotected speech, and there's already legal testing for these concepts. So I can't just make up a precedent. Oh, this makes me feel icky, therefore government go do something. Otherwise, I'll be as big of a piece of shit as some of the people I criticize on the right wing. So I'll try to hold to my principles as maximally as possible.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. Also, keep in mind before I go, there's another argument in the Mahmoud Khalil case, which is a due process issue of about whether or not. So, for example, imagine that the law said you're deportable if the president doesn't like you. right? There are some vagueness concerns that has actually in the district court, they've said that the law that they're trying to apply to Mahmoud Khalil is likely unconstitutional for vagueness reasons. They said we're not addressing the First Amendment right now, but because it's so unconstitutionally vague what is meant by it, and because the due process clause does apply, there is potential for like imagine, for example, the law literally said, if the president doesn't like you, you are deportable. Do you think that law would be constitutional? I mean, you don't have access to all that doctrine, but there's a big conversation about whether or not laws are impermissibly vague, and so that's one thing I want to clue in on.
Well, that was one of the things that I think we got into a tiff about, because I was effectively arguing specifically the terrorism shit, and you were saying the State Department isn't even using that. They're effectively using. Yeah. The State Department, we think that these people being in our country interferes with our foreign policy, which I would have never done just on principle, because technically anybody who talks about anything ever could be offensive to the foreign policy of the United States.
Yeah, no. So that's what the court held, that it was impermissibly vague. That statute was likely on its face unconstitutional. I want, before I leave, do you add me to your redirect, because I can't do the raid into you.
Sure. I'm a boomer, so you're gonna have to give me a couple of weeks.
Okay.
So
everyone go to Valor.
What I was gonna say is,
go ahead. You go.
Yeah. No, I was gonna shout you out, and then I was gonna shout myself out.
Yeah. You go then.
Okay. So if you guys enjoyed this question, we still got dozens upon dozens of you in chat. I understand that wasn't the Pisco fireworks show that we're normally used to, but Pisco overall, like, we disagree and we fight like cats and dogs, but he's a genuinely good dude. So Pisco's Hour, PISCO''S, Hour, HOUR. Check him out on YouTube. I think he goes live a few times a week. And then for me, for the people who are in Pisco's chat, if you thought that I was not particularly obnoxious today, and you actually want to check out my content, there's two places you can find me. Number one, type in Counterpoints Politics. I'm live 9:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. on Tuesdays. The rest of the week, Monday through Friday, I'm live on Valor Media Network. VALOR, Media Common Spelling, Network Common Spelling.
Guys, go. If you like that, go watch his shit. Go sub to him right now. I'm not going to raid into him. I'll teach him how to do it later to do it, but just go to his stream.
We'll figure out tech shit. Yeah, I'm a boomer.
I have to go. But thank you, Connor, very much for having me. And yeah, we'll talk real soon.